Hello, students, and welcome to another lecture for research methods in the behavioral sciences. Today, this is the lecture for part 2 of Introduction, Acquiring Knowledge in the Scientific Method. This is affiliated with chapter 1 in your text, so hopefully you're reading along and kind of filling in the gaps of the lecture as we go. But as I often like to do, I would like to start this lecture with a quote from Hugh Pickens, who is a physicist, who says, quote, "In organic chemistry, you can't memorize all the possible answers. You have to rely on intuition, generalizing from specific examples. This skill, far more than the details of every reaction, may actually be useful for medicine. It seems a lot like diagnosis. That cognitive skill, inductive generalization from specific cases to something you've never seen before, that's something you learn in organic chemistry." Now, I have news for Hugh Pickens. That is not unique to organic chemistry. When he says it's a lot like diagnosis, it is a lot like diagnosis. So this critical thinking skill that I would like you to learn as we proceed through some research methods is a skill that you will also use, especially if you go into any other science, or even if you go into an applied area of psychology. It really, in many ways, is an important aspect of critical thinking. Generalizing, when drawing general conclusions from observations about specific cases and being able to apply it to something you haven't seen before. Think about this from a clinical standpoint. Every person that you would ever see who has a common mental disorder like bipolar disorder, they're all unique. They all present with a little bit different variation of symptoms. They're all individuals. And how are you going to be able to recognize that case as being a diagnosis of bipolar disorder unless you've seen cases and you can generalize from that individual to fit it into that general description of a type, which is bipolar disorder. So this piece of information from Hugh Pickens, this observation from him, actually has a lot of implications above and beyond just research methods. So with that, we will proceed on to our agenda, which, as always, I have one little housekeeping announcement for you. We'll go through the objectives, then the lecture, and a discussion, which we can have if you send me a question, and then assignment. Okay, so I want to let you know a little bit about an extra credit opportunity which is available in this class. I have an extra credit lab that is available to you in lab. And that is at the end of the semester, and you can replace one missing lab grade. I have an extra credit lab, it's lab 16. But in lecture, I will give you 5 points of extra credit for every evening lecture that you watch and write a 1-page double-spaced summary. And you can do up to 2 of those. So there is available 10 points of extra credit in this class, 5 for each of 2 evening lectures. You can do 1 if you like, you can do 2 if you like, or you can do none. But here I provided you with a link to the evening lectures. So you can watch those, and those are not due until the end of the semester. You might not think you need extra credit right now, we're just starting. But if you need extra credit down the road, know that that is available to you. We don't have all our evening lectures available there, just a handful of them. And I think the one that I did in the fall, about a year ago, by the time you're watching this lecture, is the featured one. And I think that's because we really haven't had too many since then. In fact, I don't think we've had any since then because of COVID. But they're all about an hour long. And again, write a 1-page double-spaced summary of what you learned in order to get the extra credit. Okay, so here are our objectives for this lecture. 1 is to practice adopting an attitude of healthy skepticism towards scientific findings. I did not give you the articles to review and discuss, but I'm going to describe them to you so you can sort of understand a little bit about why we might want to be skeptical about claims that appear to be scientific. Then we'll review some terms that are commonly used in research methods. Once I give you these terms, I will expect you to have a working knowledge of them because I will plan to use them from here on out in my lectures. Some of the terms you might think that you already know the definitions of because you've heard them a lot. Terms like variable or theory or hypothesis. But in research methods, we have very precise definitions of these terms, and I want you to know them precisely. We'll also talk about methods of inquiry. I'd like you to understand and evaluate various methods of establishing the truth. The scientific method, believe this or not, is only one method. There are other methods. The reason the scientific method gets so much positive focus is because it is the single method upon which there is consensus across the scientific community, just that we have agreed that this is currently the best method of establishing the truth. That doesn't mean in every circumstance in your personal life you're going to want to rely on the scientific method. I mean, people don't have time to read primary source articles with respect to every decision they're making in their life. So we will talk about those other methods and compare and contrast them to the scientific method. We'll talk about entry points in the wheel of inquiry in the scientific method, and that is a discussion of the behaviors that are required to implement or engage in the scientific method. And then we'll talk about the research process. You should be able to describe it. Now, here is a little slide for which I just want you to kind of think through a little bit. You don't have access to these articles. I think it's too much for the online students, but I'm going to tell you about a little bit about them. There were 4 different claims, 2 of which are kind of related regarding autism, that have been made, scientific claims that have been made, that are just teeny tiny examples of why we need to be sort of skeptical about these claims. One, with respect to that upper orange puzzle piece, is conflicts of interest. A few years ago, I was at a pediatrician's office, more than a few years ago. My kids were very small then. And I saw a sales circular for a stimulant drug called Concerta, in which they made the claim, "I see my child doing well in school." Well, to the ordinary observer, that might make you think that if you gave your child this medication, Concerta, that they would then do well in school. On the flyer, though, they actually provided some data about, and they provided this in the form of graphs, where they illustrated how the performance of children given Concerta improved after they took the drug relative to prior to having taken the drug. Unfortunately, what they don't speak to is that despite the improvement, the kids taking Concerta were still only getting 45% of the problems with which they were presented, the math problems, correct, which by any measure does not translate to doing well in school. So what I'm saying here is not that your child shouldn't take Concerta. If they have a diagnosis of ADHD, which is the condition for which Concerta is used, then you should consult with the pediatrician. However, you need to weigh the benefits and risks. If your child is doing very poorly in school and what you're after is an improvement in their accuracy of doing math problems, then okay. But if your goal is for your child to do well in school, I guess it depends on how you define doing well. So what I'm saying is picking apart the claims to see what they mean by something so vague as "I see my child doing well in school." These other 2, the purple and the yellow puzzle pieces, are regarding articles that were published illustrating that there had previously been a link established between the use of vaccines and the development of autism. Now, you're probably all familiar with this debacle because there was a study published, I'm going to say maybe 15, 20 years ago by now, in which there was a correlational link established between the two. And by correlational, I mean it was temporal, mainly temporal. And that is children who were acquiring symptoms of autism were acquiring them around the same time that they received these vaccinations that were intended for them to then be able to go to preschool and not develop these illnesses, common illnesses, you know, like whooping cough and tetanus and, you know, whatever else they vaccinate for, measles, mumps, rubella, that's the MMR vaccine. Well, that study was spoken about quite a bit in popular culture. Jenny McCarthy, she's an actress. She became a spokesperson against vaccinating your children because of the risks of autism, only later to be discovered that this study that was published had a ginormous amount of weaknesses, some of which came from ethical issues, how they selected the sample, fudging data, all kinds of issues, such that they retracted the article. But by that point, that information had already been disseminated into the general population. And now, even to this day, I think people are a little hesitant to vaccinate their children because they're afraid of the risk of autism. Well, here's what I have to say about that. Correlation, I'm probably sure that you've heard by now, does not indicate causation. So even if there is an association between those two things, that doesn't definitively mean that what came before is the cause and what comes after is the effect. There might be multitudinous other variables associated with vaccinating your children that play a mediating role in the risk of the development of autism. Now, am I saying that vaccinations do not cause autism? No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying we don't know. I am saying that the risk of giving your children those vaccines needs to be weighed against the risk of your children acquiring those illnesses, those childhood illnesses. Now, my understanding of it is that if your child acquires whooping cough, their risk of dying or having some ill effect is far greater than the risk of developing autism, or even autism in relation to the administration of vaccines. However, that's a personal decision. I personally would consult the science. I would probably consult someone I consider to be an expert in the field, like my child's pediatrician. And then if I felt strongly about it, I would weigh those benefits and risks. However, the claim that vaccines cause autism has been debunked. We do not know if they cause autism. We do not know the cause of autism at the present point in time. The last article was an alternative interpretation of findings. That should cause you reason for skepticism. There was an article published in the Arizona Republic about 20 years ago that said swim lessons for tots are called useless. And in the article, they presented raw data on the number of children who drowned, the number of children who presented to emergency rooms for submersion in the water, and the number of children who had had swim lessons. And the percentage of children who presented in the emergency room for submersion, the raw numbers were, or the percentages were far greater than for children who had not had swim lessons. But that was all they presented, was the percentages. When you looked at the raw numbers, the children who presented to the emergency room for submersion who had not had swim lessons was far greater. So the lesson of that little light purple jigsaw puzzle piece is that when a claim is made as a headline, you need to dig a little deeper and you need to look at the data sometimes or the statistics for yourself. This is especially true these days where there's so much bias in the media. Everything is framed in a way anymore that the person delivering the information wants you to perceive it. There's very little reporting of just the straight up facts or straight up observations. So I personally have found, especially over summer, when I'm not really teaching that much, that it's worth my while to dig a little deeper and find the primary sources if it's something that I really want to know about. So, common weaknesses in research and a reason for you to have some healthy skepticism with respect to scientific claims. Okay, so now a quick review of terms. These are the terms I want you to be familiar with. I really want you to know these terms, memorize them, process them, think about examples of them, whatever you need to do to have a working knowledge of these terms. Throw away whatever understanding you had of them before, because you will need to know the precise definition of these terms. The first one is variable. I think everybody thinks they know what a variable is, but it's hard to define. Sometimes when I ask students what is a variable, they say something that varies. Well, it's not useful to define a term using the term. So here's a precise definition of a variable. It's a trait, a behavior, or a characteristic. That's in psychology. In other fields, it's often a substance, some kind of physical, tangible object. But in psychology, it's often a trait or a behavior or a characteristic that can be measured and has 2 or more levels. And by levels, that's how it varies. It is capable of taking on quantities or qualities in 2 or more levels. Okay, so by quantity, what I mean is amount. A numerical value can be attached to it in term that reflects amount. With respect to quality, that means type or kind. In research methods, though, we only analyze numbers. So if you hearken back to your days of statistics and remember the levels of measurement, nominal, ordinal, interval, ratio, we'll revisit those again later, but those reflect the numerical values that symbolize or reflect those levels across which a variable can change. So a variable has to be capable of changing. What does that mean, change? That means adopt different levels, either qualitatively or quantitatively. So that's variable. The next term is theory. A theory is a proposed explanation for a phenomenon. It's an overarching framework that accounts for a set of observations. So if you go back to our analogy of the detective with JonBenét Ramsey, their theory was their explanation of all the different observations they might make. There were fingerprints on the bowl of pineapple. There were no tool marks that were in evidence showing that someone tried to break and enter. There were no footprints in the snow. Patsy Ramsey couldn't have been excluded as a writer of the ransom note. All of those are a bunch of observations. Well, what accounts for those observations? What explains them and causes them to hang together as a reasonable and logical explanation? Well, that's the theory. And in the detective analogy, it's who killed her. But in science, it works the same way. It's a proposed explanation for a phenomenon. Now, a hypothesis is usually generated from a theory. If that theory is true and these conditions are met, then these are the observations that you should see. So if the parents killed JonBenét Ramsey, then you won't see DNA from an intruder anywhere. Then you might uncover a motivation when you're interviewing the Ramseys, and on and on and on. That's a hypothesis. However, in research methods, a hypothesis is in a very structured format. And this is the part I would really like you to memorize and commit to your memory for the rest of your life, because we're going to use this in lab. A hypothesis is a statement about the expected relationship between variables. So it's a prediction. If all these things are true and these conditions are met, then this is what I expect to happen. So it's a statement about what you expect to happen with regard to the relationship between variables. And in your guys' projects, it'll be 2 variables. In some of the research you're going to be reading, it's multivariate, which means there's many variables involved. But you guys are starting in on the ground floor, so you will be starting with only 2 variables. So your hypotheses that you will be generating in lab are statements about the expected relationship between 2 variables, and we'll be working with that quite a bit in lab. A correlation. Now, a correlation is not the same as a correlation coefficient. A correlation coefficient, as you probably remember from statistics, is the way the relationship between 2 variables is quantified, so it's a numerical value. But a correlation, or more specifically, a correlational study, is a study that has certain elements present that allow you to examine the relationship or association between 2 variables. Okay, so that's all it does. You only can see if those variables vary or change in relation to one another. That's it. That's correlation. And there are certain elements that are present there that we're going to be learning about in the middle of the semester. That is in contrast to an experiment. An experiment is kind of, I guess you can consider it the holy grail of science, because, I mean, not the correlations aren't important, they are, but experiments bring a little more information to the party. They not only look at relationships between variables, they specifically can tell you if there is a causal, C-A-U-S-A-L, causal relationship between those variables. In other words, an experiment meets certain criteria or has certain elements that allow the researcher to draw cause and effect conclusions. What are those elements? Well, again, we're going to be learning about that in the middle of the semester, but an experiment is unique from a correlational study. An experimental study meets the required elements that allow you to draw cause and effect conclusions. Now, you might be familiar with experiments and that they have independent variables and dependent variables, and then they have variables that are controlled and blah, blah, blah. We're going to be learning more about that. But the defining trait of an experiment is that it meets certain requirements that allow you to draw cause and effect conclusions. Okay, and then the last is replication. That's an easy one. I just remember R, replication stands for repeat. That means you're repeating a study. So it's a repetition of a study, rerunning a study using the same methodology, using the same processes and procedures as the previous study in an attempt to confirm findings. There's been a lot of controversy in psychology. There's a whole series of studies done called the Replication Project, where they're finding that well-established findings in psychology, when subject to replication, haven't stood up. So we can talk about that a little bit later, but psychology's kind of taken some body blows from the Replication Project, where findings that have been basically, doctrine in psychology are now being questioned, which I think is a good thing and lends to my statement in the previous lecture where I said there is no such thing as settled science. The hallmark of science is debating and questioning. Remember that. Oh, there was one other one. I forgot about this. Qualitative versus quantitative research. That was not in my notes. What we're studying this semester is quantitative research. And that is, again, quantity means amount, and qualitative means type or kind. So the type of research methods that you're learning revolves around quantities. And that is, we attach numerical values to human traits and characteristics. We quantify them, okay? Whether that's nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio, we quantify them, and we observe patterns by looking at aggregate data. There is a whole other branch of research called qualitative research, where the attachment of numerical values to human behaviors and traits and characteristics is de-emphasized. but this is one half of that picture. Actually, most studies in psychology are quantitative, not qualitative. Qualitative you can find more in like anthropology, sociology, social work, some of those disciplines. And they have some great studies, but psychology tends to be more quantitative. It seems like we align ourselves more with what are sometimes called the hard sciences, although I think we kind of fall somewhere in between, but we do like to quantify human traits and characteristics and analyze those numbers in the aggregate so that we can then draw generalizations like I was talking about in the very first slide. Okay, so as I was telling you earlier, we have various methods of inquiry in psychology. The scientific method is only one and represents our best ability to reach consensus in establishing the truth. That doesn't mean it's the only way. There is another method called the method of authority. Now, with this method, you are relying upon someone who you see as being an expert in the field to establish for you the truth. Okay, so someone who you consider to be credible, consider to be an expert. So examples of this would be faith-based explanations. So if you have, a clergy member, a rabbi, a medicine man, an imam, whoever you consider to be sort of a faith leader or an expert, you might rely upon that person to give you the truth, okay? That's a useful method for some things. The scientific method can answer everything. So it can't answer questions regarding ethics or morality or faith-based questions. Science does not attempt to tackle those. Rather, in that case, you may want to rely upon a method of authority. If you want an expert opinion regarding whether or not to give your child medication for ADHD, you might want to rely on the method of authority. One of the issues with this is that you're not always certain about the credentials or background of a person who is a psychologist or is an expert. Some people might pass themselves off as experts or psychologists when you don't really even know what their background might be. And those people can also be in error because you're relying on their interpretation of science. I have these examples of ever believing in Santa Claus or your parents as being experts or authorities, because when you're a little kid, you see your parents as an authority. They know the truth. They can reach the candy jar that's up on the high shelf. I mean, they know everything. But sometimes parents obviously are influenced by cultural beliefs, and an example of this is believing in Santa Claus. I've had my own experience with this with my own children. We did what is common in this culture, which is tell them that Santa Claus brings gifts to them while we're sleeping at night. And if you're a good little girl or boy, then you'll get presents under the tree in the morning. Of course, even if they were naughty, they still got presents. However, my kids, they believed in Santa Claus. They thought Santa Claus was an almighty fact. Santa Claus was a person who existed. However, Santa Claus kind of has his roots in the Christian faith. Most people know that, Santa Claus is an idea. Santa Claus is, the spirit of goodness or whatever. And so my children were both shocked to realize that Santa was not a tangible reality, a flesh and blood human being. And so their reliance upon me as their authoritative parent was at that point a little bit questioned. And the truth is they still question my authority. But anyway, so that's the method of authority. It has its strengths and weaknesses, as all these methods do. The next method is intuition, and that is gut feelings. This is great maybe for making some personal choices, maybe some moral or ethical choices in your personal life. In this case, you feel that you believe something is true just because you feel it's true, because you have a gut instinct or hunch that it's true. The problem is, and I've experienced that myself, something I strongly and firmly believe to be true, later come to find out in the face of hard and fast evidence that I was mistaken about that. So in that case, these gut feelings are sort of subject to personal biases, preconceived notions or expectations, or maybe even stereotypes. These gut feelings, there really isn't any supporting data. That doesn't mean it can't be a good starting point for examining something from the scientific method. Tenacity, I love this method of inquiry, or establishing the truth. Tenacity is the process of believing that something is true because it's withstood the test of time. So it's been repeated, it's been handed down, let's say, from generation to generation. When I ask students to give examples of some of their beliefs about something being true because it's been handed down to them from their family, I always get all kinds of interesting responses. But they're like what used to be called, maybe still are, old wives' tales, like, chicken soup cures a cold, which I think has actually been subjected to the scientific method. And they found out that it does relieve the symptoms, but it doesn't cure a cold. I had a student one time that was talking about how her family believed that if you blew smoke in a baby's ear, it would improve an ear infection. So it's been established through repetition or tenacity. It's hung on. It's come about through habit. You've heard it over and over again. Sometimes it becomes stronger over time. Urban legends are an example of this. And one of the reasons why some of these observations hang on in their beliefs as being true is because people pay attention to events that are consistent with their beliefs. I think this has been one of the problems with that belief that vaccines cause autism. Because they pay attention to the cases where children develop the symptoms of autism around the time that they receive the vaccinations. Okay. The next method of inquiry is rationalism. This is a method of inquiry that was established by René Descartes, who was a philosopher. It's a form of logic. And it has premises, arguments, and conclusions following an if and then format. So it has assumptions, which are premises, and then you apply these rules of logic. I think René Descartes was the one who said, I think, therefore I am. But here's an example of the if and then logic. So if all 3-year-old children are afraid of the dark, and Amy is a 3-year-old child, then Amy is afraid of the dark. That's the format, if and then. The problem with rationalism is that the premises are assumptions that you are assuming to be true. And in the example I just gave you, the premise, if, so it's conditional. And in this case, it's not true. All 3-year-old children are not afraid of the dark. So the conclusions of this reasoning process rely upon the validity of the premise, which is not always true. It does provide us with a structure and a format for reasoning. The last method of inquiry is called empiricism, and this is acquiring knowledge through direct observation that is acquired through the senses: seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. Remember, you learn those 5 senses when you're in, kindergarten or something. So it's limiting the use of assumptions or what are called inferences, guesses, okay? And it's based solely on what you observe. So limits guessing about the truth to being based on only what you directly observe. The beauty of this is that it allows testing of consensus. So if I observe something, okay, I just injected this rat with this substance and the rat became hyperactive. Did you see that? I saw that. I observed it. We measure the hyperactivity. We measure the substance that was injected. So it allows that testing of consensus. It does limit the use of inference, as I said before, which is interpretations or making conclusions about what you observed. You're just basing it on information that is sensory in nature. The problem is that as a method of inquiry, this might be necessary, but not sufficient. Why? Well, the best explanation comes to us through a Chinese proverb. We see things as we don't see things as they are, but as we are. So again, creeps in that personal bias. If you inject the rat with the substance, what do you mean by hyperactivity? What I might see as hyperactivity might not be the same as what you define as hyperactivity. So it is necessary, but not sufficient for establishing the truth. Okay, now to test this out, I'm going to show you right now, after this blank slide, a slide, and I want you to look at it, and I want you to just tell me an explanation. Sorry, I had to cough. I want you to give me an explanation of what's going on here, okay? What's the best explanation? What do you think is going on? I'll give you a second to kind of explain to me what you see, what happened in the slide. Okay, what you're going to do is make some observations, and you're going to give me a theory that explains your observation. It accounts for the facts, the empirical, sensory, visual facts of what you see here. Okay, what do you think happened? Well, common explanations, I'll just tell you of what students say, is a lot of times they say, okay, well, there was a big bird and a little bird, and they were walking along, and they got in a fight, and the big bird ate the little bird and then walked away. Does that not seem like a reasonable explanation? It does to me. But do we know that that's what happened? No. Your theory, if that was your theory, that a big bird ate a little bird and then flew away cannot be directly proven. All you can do is try to establish the best theory that accounts for these facts. Now, when I ask students, what are some other possible explanations? Try to think outside the box. A lot of times I have 24 students in my class, so I get a bunch of different other possibilities. It's just amazing to hear. Some students will say, well, you don't really even know that those are birds. Maybe they're dinosaurs. Maybe it's people wearing bird shoes. Maybe it's some other kind of animal, and you don't even know that the big footprints belong to something bigger and the little footprints belong to something littler. And how do you know that one thing ate the other thing? Maybe the little thing jumped on the big thing's back, or maybe the little thing flew away. Maybe they weren't fighting, as evidenced by that little scuffle in the middle. Maybe they were mating. Maybe they were playing. But the point being that you can establish a theory as to what happened here, but the best theories, the ones that are most effective at accounting for those observations, come about through multiple inputs. People with different perspectives, thinking outside the box, thinking differently, that are contributing to the theory, which is the beauty of having multiple labs studying the same thing in the sciences, can view things a little bit differently. So the more possible explanations you can generate, the better theory you will ultimately land upon, the one that best accounts for all the facts. Now, if you have an observation or a fact that refutes that theory or is inconsistent with the theory, you either better revise that theory or maybe you better scrap that theory. Okay, now let's test your ability to distinguish observation from inference. Okay, remember I was talking to you about observations coming to you through the senses, inferences being leaps of logic that require interpretation. Okay, here's the first little vignette. A man in a drugstore fell to the floor clutching his chest, and the other customers turned in his direction when he screamed. Is that an inference or is that observation? Think a minute. Hopefully you said observation, because all of those things can be discussed and can be confirmed through consensus. Did you see the man? Were we in a drugstore? Did he fall to the floor? Did he clutch his chest? Did the other customers turn in his direction? Did he scream? Okay, so that's all visual and auditory information. That is purely observation. How about this? The pigeon, which had been pecking at the disc, was distracted by the sound of the door slamming, and it hesitated while it considered whether to peck or not. Think, think, think. Well, there's some observation, but a lot of inference in there. First of all, it's an observation that a pigeon was pecking at a disc, but how do you know it was distracted? Distraction is something that can be directly observed. Do pigeons even get distracted? I don't know. Also, considering, do pigeons consider whether to peck or not? That's also an inference. So this little vignette consists an awful lot of inference. How about this? When the dinner with her husband's parents was over, she was so anxious to leave and go home that she left her coat behind. Think, think, think. What's your answer? A lot of inference there too. You are interpreting the leaving of her coat behind as reflecting anxiety. Now, maybe it does and maybe it doesn't. You could establish as an observation that she left her coat behind. She had dinner. Her husband and her husband's parents were there. The dinner was over. She went home. But you are interpreting her leaving of her coat behind as being reflective of anxiety, which is an inference. How about this one? The old man looked both ways several times before he stepped off the curb and slowly walked across the street. Think, think, think. If you said observation, you would be correct about that. No inferences there. Okay, so now let me say about this. Psychology does rely on empiricism. However, when we use inferences, we must convert those inferences into something that can be seen, smelled, heard, tasted, or felt. Okay? And we're going to talk about that in the chapter on defining and measuring variables. Any hypothetical idea like anxiety or consideration or hesitation or distraction must be converted into an empirical concept. We will talk about that in the chapter on defining and measuring variables. So we've talked about these different methods of inquiry: empiricism, rationality, authority, tenacity, blah, blah, blah. Well, let's talk about the scientific method, shall we? The scientific method, the beauty of it is that it incorporates many aspects of those other methods of inquiry. For example, the scientific method is empirical. As I just said, we convert those inferences into variables that can be directly observed and measured. So it does rely on empiricism. Our knowledge is acquired through the senses. It does follow the format of rationality. We use logic and reason. Our hypotheses are related in an if and then format, and it follows those rules of logic. The scientific method is also parsimonious. I love that word, parsimonious. Just kind of rolls off the tongue. But I need to give you an explanation of what parsimony is by way of an example. What does parsimonious actually mean? Well, the actual definition is like stingy, miserly. But what it means in this case is simplified. Parsimony is often referred to as Occam's razor. I think that comes from some story in philosophy where by razor, I think it means it cuts away like a razor all the assumptions and extraneous conditions to get down to the core. And it basically means the simplest explanation is the best. Here's an example. In December of 1903, there was a fire in the Iroquois Theater in Chicago and 602 people died. It was tragic. If you look at this online, they have pictures of bodies just lined up. It was horrible. And when they looked into what happened, they found that the circumstances were odd. The people that were deceased were not killed directly by the fire, like burned or smoke inhalation, but they had been trampled in the panic. Isn't that awful? It's like Walmart on Black Friday. People get trampled. Well, that's what happened in this case. People were trampled to death. Okay, now I want you to stop and think for a minute. Why? How can you explain the behavior of people who would trample other people to death? That's horrible. I would like to think I would never do that. I would like to think you would never do that. What accounts for that? What theory explains that mob-like behavior? Well, a lot of times students will say that people will behave that way when they're in fear for their lives. So they felt like they had no choice. It was either trample others or die. Okay, that's a reasonable theory. That's a reasonable explanation for why people would behave that way. But consider this. In December 1979, more than 70 years later, 74 years later, in Cincinnati, Ohio, there was a Who concert. The crowd lined up. Do you guys know the Who? That's even kind of before my generation, so it certainly is before you. But it's a really popular band. People crazy loved it at the time. Crowd lines up. As the doors open, the crowd surges forward, and 11 people were trampled to death. They had open seating, unreserved seating at the time. So why? What would cause people to behave in that way? Let's apply the theory that we just came up with for the Iroquois theater to that example, that people will behave that way, trample others because they're in fear for their lives. Well, that doesn't really work. They weren't in fear for their lives. They weren't escaping a fire. They weren't escaping death. Why were people trampled? It wasn't life-threatening. You're not going to die if you get stuck in the poor seats. Well, a better, more parsimonious explanation is that people will engage in mob-like behavior and even go so far as to possibly injure others when valuable resources are perceived to be limited. They're only attainable for a very brief period of time. That's the case in both of those examples. In the case of the Iroquois theater, the valuable resource was life. In the case of the Who concert, the valuable resource was the good seats, and they were perceived to be limited. Think how powerful that theory is. It can explain a lot of human behavior. Black Friday at Walmart, it can explain. Overuse of medical insurance health coverage. Mobs who descend upon food in times of starvation explain so much. The simplest explanation that explains the most amount of behavior with the fewest conditions and assumptions possible is the most parsimonious. And that is one of the values of the scientific method. The next is that the scientific method is public. We publish, we present our findings so that it can be, it can disseminate information. It can be scrutinized by others, consumers, and other experts. It is deterministic. I love this characteristic as well. What does that mean, it's deterministic? Well, deterministic means that it focuses on an attempt to explain natural phenomenon, as opposed to, let's say, supernatural phenomenon. So you won't find in science an attempt to establish, say, that tornadoes come about on towns that have defied God's will. That belongs with respect to faith-based explanation, not in the scientific method. So it focuses on the natural, things that are part of our natural world, things that can be empirically investigated. Falsifiable. This is another of my favorite characteristics, and this one is very important in terms of what's going on now. If you want to hear about falsifiability, I talk quite a bit about that in my evening lecture. I see this happening all the time now. People presenting as fact things that are not falsifiable. And I'll give you an example of this, not a current example, but something you can probably relate to. Okay, years ago, I was watching a trailer for a movie called The Right. I was going through this little phase where I was kind of interested in movies where the focus of these movies was exorcism. I don't know why. I'm usually not a person that focuses on the supernatural, but I just went through a phase, and Anthony Hopkins was in this movie, and it was all about Anthony Hopkins, who was the elderly priest, training this young, of course, good-looking, youthful priest how to do exorcisms. And the youthful priest was a little bit of a skeptic, and he questioned Anthony Hopkins about, the utility of exorcisms and how do you know they work and all of this. And Anthony Hopkins made a statement that illustrates something that is not falsifiable. And it was this. He said to the young priest in a very whispery tone, I'll make this real dramatic for you. The only proof we have that the devil exists is that there is no proof that the devil exists. That's what he said. Okay, well, that statement is not falsifiable. And that is because if you have some hard and fast proof that the devil exists, great, the devil exists. If we have scientific proof that the devil exists, we will know that the devil exists. But if we have no proof, that proof is also proof. That lack of proof is proof that the devil exists. So either way, the devil is going to exist. That is an example of not being falsifiable. And that, you need to get good at recognizing that because it's everywhere now. For example, claims of hidden epidemics. That's my favorite non-falsifiable claim, and I talk about that in my presentation. A hidden epidemic. Okay, so if you have a lot of cases of something, that's proof of an epidemic. But if you don't have any cases, that's also proof of an epidemic. It's just hidden. See how that's not falsifiable? I'm telling you. So the scientific method requires that the claims are falsifiable. It is collaborative. We work with other people, as I illustrated in that tricky tracks exercise we just did. Better explanations come about when you work with other people. The scientific method is rigorously evaluated, is replicated, it is scrutinized, it is questioned. Science is never settled. But it is also tentative. And by that I mean, you'll see this in some of the studies that you're going to read. The language is tentative. It is possible that. It has been observed that. Because as I said, if you use terms like it's been proven, we know this for a fact, you're going to look like a fool because sure enough, a study's going to come along that questions your findings. It is also, did I say this? Scrutinized. I already said that. Okay. The last thing I want to say about the scientific method is that it's kind of taken a beating now. And some of the things that are emerging out of science are also being questioned. I have a link to a little riff that John Oliver did on the problems with science, and I find it very instructive. Of course, John Oliver, I'm not usually a huge fan, but he's pretty funny. That's like a 20-minute segment that he does. I didn't include it here because it's a little naughty. If you ever listen to John Oliver, he says some inappropriate things, like some inappropriate sexual comments he makes in there. And with all of this canceling that's going on, I hate to say that it makes professors second guess academic freedom a little bit, so I didn't include the link. However, if you want to watch it, send me a request and I will send you the link. That way, if you're offended, it's on you. But it's pretty interesting. He talks about a couple of concepts that are pretty good observations about science. So I would recommend watching it if you can get over the sexually inappropriate stuff that he says. So if you're interested in that, send me a request and I will be happy to send you the link. All right, so here's just a little exercise. I want you to look at these questions and just tell me if you think they're questions that could be appropriately asked using the scientific method. What happens to you after you die? Well, that depends what you mean by that. What happens to your physical, natural self? Yes, science can answer that. But what happens to your soul or spirit? No, science can't answer that. That's in the supernatural realm. Does caffeine make people anxious? Yes, that can be answered as long as anxiety is converted into an empirical concept. Is abortion right or wrong? No, can't be answered. That belongs maybe in the realm of a faith-based explanation. That regards morality. That's regarding morality or ethics rather than science. Now, it can give you some information about the physical process of abortion or what happens during an abortion or whatever. But the rightness or wrongness is a question of morality or ethics. Do college students consume more beer than other age groups? Yes, we can answer that. Can even make an educated guess about that. Do students remember information longer after preparing for essay exams than for multiple choice exams? Yes, science can answer that. Does memory get worse in old age? Yes, can answer that. Do rats crave cocaine? Yes, again, similar to does caffeine make people anxious? As long as you convert that inference craving into an empirical idea, yes, that can be studied. Okay, now here's just a little graphic of the wheel of inquiry, observing a behavior or other phenomenon, forming a tentative answer or explanation, using your hypothesis to generate testable prediction, evaluating the prediction using observations, with questions kind of being in the middle. I've already talked about this in the last study, but how does that convert to actual behaviors in science? Well, this can be found in the cover of your textbook, and I'd like you to be familiar with this. Again, these aren't necessarily always steps that are done in a linear fashion. Do one, check it off. Do the next, check it off. Sometimes there's doubling back, skipping steps, moving around. But these are basically the steps in the scientific method. Finding an idea, forming a hypothesis, defining and measuring variables, identifying participants, selecting a research strategy, selecting a design, conducting a study, evaluating the data, reporting the results, refining or reformulating. Now, this is what you're going to be doing this semester, mostly in lab. All my labs are designed to help you step by step with each of these different steps. We will in lab help you find an idea. You will convert that idea into a hypothesis. You will then learn to define and measure your variables, etc., broken down bit by bit for you in lab. Note that many of these steps also correspond with chapters in your textbook. So it's going to be very well organized for you. If you do the labs, you will engage in each of these processes, and by the end of the semester, you will have your complete project finished with an APA-style manuscript. Okay, and I'm looking forward to reading all of your studies. Last, here is just, you probably can't see that thing in the corner, just sort of some interesting perspectives on science. Moe, the bartender from The Simpsons, he makes me laugh. He says, science, what's science ever done for us? Oh, come on. Science has done more than we can even wrap our minds around in this little lecture. But science has made its fair share of mistakes. And you can see this reflected in these various ads that I'm sharing with you. I mean, my goodness, in the 50s and 60s, look at this article or this advertisement saying, doctors smoke Camel cigarettes more than any other. Oh my gosh, if you went to go see your doctor and he was smoking a cigarette like that, what would you do? I'd probably turn around and leave, because now we know cigarettes cause cancer. Other issues, cocaine, toothache drops. Cocaine helps your toothache. Yes, it may also cause you an addiction. Television, what does that say? Benefits children. Oh my goodness, now we know that's not the case. And then this one in the corner you may not be able to see is how mother and baby picked up. It's by drinking. They're advocating drinking while you're breastfeeding your baby so that you can relax. So science has corrected a lot of these false ideas, and I hope you will keep that in mind. It's been a joy lecturing to you. I only wish you were here so that we could have a little more conversation. If you have any questions, please be sure to message me. There's a little, if you want to blow that up, you can see some milestones of science. And then you should be finishing reading chapter 1. And in the next lecture, we'll start into chapter 16. That's also in 2 parts, writing an APA-style research report. Until I see you next time, hope you're all doing well. Have a wonderful day.